Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Brown, and I'm the guide manager at Alpine Ascents International. Thanks for joining our Vinson Webinar this afternoon. Mount Vinson is the crown jewel of our winter expedition, and for a good reason. Over 15 years in a row, 100% of our teams have reached the summit. For many of our climbers, Vinson represents the final step in their 7 summits journey, and we're incredibly proud to help make those goals a reality. Today's webinar is led by our senior guide, Don Wargowsky. Don began climbing on the East Coast 23 years ago and spent the last 15 years guiding high-altitude expeditions all over the globe. He's led expeditions to the summit of Everest and Manaslu and has spent the last several winters guiding in Antarctica. He holds a master's degree in education and is passionate about teaching, whether it's climbing skills, avalanche safety, or helping climbers achieve big mountain goals. He's guided in 12 countries, but spends most of his time these days in Washington, Nepal, and of course, Antarctica. And fun fact, Don once accidentally guided a dog named Mara to the summit of Burunse, believed to be the first 7,000-meter ascent by a canine. But we'll save that story for another webinar. Before we dive in, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have questions throughout the webinar, pop them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. And keep an eye out on the chat for helpful links and resources that I'll pop in during the webinar. And once again, while Don gets set up, if you haven't already, in the chat, drop your name, where you're tuning in from, and what has attracted you to Vinson. And that's all I got. Don, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to jump into our presentation here, give you a quick screen share. Give me 2 seconds for that. And boom. There we go. Everybody can see that, yeah? Perfect. Great. So yeah, for our webinar today, kind of the goal and plan to go through here is want to chat a little bit about Antarctica and of course Mount Vinson specifically, chat about who this climb is for and some of the prerequisites for that climb, what we need to do to be ready to go, and chat about the itinerary of the climb itself, kind of what things look like on a day-to-day basis, as well as the logistics of getting there, what to bring. And of course, we'll have some time for some Q&A here at the end. Again, to reiterate what Mary said, if you do have any questions along the way, don't want you to forget those things. Please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll do the absolute best we can to address all those at the end. Of course, if there's anything that we don't get to, or if you're like me and you manage to think of all your questions about 5 minutes after the Zoom meeting's over, please feel free to reach out to the company. We have lots of people here, including myself, that'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have afterward. So in terms of this trip, I think a really big draw of it is just going to Antarctica itself. It's a really magical place of everywhere that I've had the pleasure of working with or working at in the world. It is by far my favorite venue to work at. Just a very unique place. Antarctica itself is the coldest continent in the world. During the time of year that we're working on Mount Vinson down there, the average temperature is minus 20 degrees on the continent. And surprisingly enough, at that temperature on sunny days, it can be quite comfortable to be outside in just a sun hoodie. Of course, you know, the clouds cover the sun. It gets quite cold very quickly. For those of you that are familiar with, say, like the temperatures on a Denali climb, very similar to that, just another notch colder. It's also the driest continent on the planet. They get about 2 inches of precip there per year. The entire continent is considered a desert. It's the windiest continent in the world, and also the highest, with an average elevation of about 8,200 feet. During the time of year that we're climbing down there, we get 24 hours of daylight. Again, you know, if anyone's familiar with climbing on Denali, very much like that, but I'd say even a little bit more intense sun. You can read a book in your tent at 3 o'clock in the morning at any point during the season down there. And what's really unique about this trip is that it's inland. Most of the people who visit Antarctica, about 99% of people, only go to the coast. They're often coming in on cruise ships from South America or the southern tip of Africa or New Zealand. I think what's really special about a trip like this is that we get to be 1% of the people that visit the continent every year that go beyond the coast and into the interior of the continent. And of that, say, roughly 1,000 people a year that go inland, we're part of only a very, very small handful of folks that make it to Mount Vinson. Alpine Ascents is one of the largest providers in the world for Vinson trips. And even with that, I would say, on average year, we probably take 20, maybe 30 people a year. So it's a very unique trip. It's something that not a lot of people get a chance to experience and just makes it feel very special. In terms of the mountain itself, Mount Vinson is in the Ellsworth mountain range. You can see from this view, it's kind of on the eastern part of the continent. It's about 400 miles from the coast and 700 miles or so from the South Pole. And it's got, in terms of the seven summits, a relatively lower elevation summit at just over 16,000 feet. The great part about that is we get that high elevation feel without having to go a full on, 4 to 6 or 8 week expedition that we have on some of the other higher peaks. Makes it a little bit more attainable for people's schedule. Um, Another really unique thing about this mountain is the mountain itself was only discovered in 1957. It didn't see its first ascent until the early 60s. So, of the seven summits, it's definitely one of the least climbed by far, and has only been seeing commercial ascents, for a few decades, whereas some of our other higher peaks, say like a Kilimanjaro or Denali, have a very long history of climbing. It's pretty cool to be in a place where, again, there's only been a few hundred people. So in terms of the climbing route itself and the style in which we climb it, there's many routes on Mount Vinson, but the one route that is done commercially is known as the Branscombe Shoulder Route. And it, in the grand scheme of climbing, has a moderate difficulty. There's some moderately angled snow going up to about 40 or 45 degrees on the fixed lines. There is some kind of rock walking and scrambling toward the summit, but no technical climbing is required. We can do it with just one axe and crampons, no rock climbing involved. What makes it also pretty unique relative to our Seven Summits climbs, there's no porters there and there are no pre-established camps. So it's a bit of a Denali style climb in that we are moving from camp to camp, carrying all of our own equipment. But what's really great about the program that we have at Alpine Ascents is we're one of a handful of companies that is allowed to have permanent caches on the mountain, which would separate it from a Denali climb in that we don't have to carry tents or all of our equipment, pickets, shovels, things like that from camp to camp. Again, with Antarctica being a desert, the upside of that is we don't get a ton of new snow every year, so we can bury a cache at each camp, meaning a lot of the equipment that we have up there, like our stoves, tents, and things, can be buried under a couple feet of snow. It stays there all winter. When we come back the next season, we just dig those things up. Again, a great advantage that we have with Alpine Ascents. A lot of companies that work there don't have permission to do that, so their clients have to carry all those things from camp to camp. And just living and being in Antarctica can be challenging enough, and having the benefit of not having to carry an additional 20 to 40 pounds between camps makes the mountain a little bit more accessible for us. Again, clients are only carrying their personal gear and clothing, usually a very small amount of group food or fuel. Typical weight that a client is carrying from one camp to another would be about 45 pounds. And again, it's Denali style, meaning that we're able to carry, our heaviest carry is going to be going to low camp. And for that, we're able to pull sleds. From there, we leave the sleds at low camp. We go up fixed lines carrying just a backpack, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner here. We take backpacks up to our high camp, and then we can pare things down and go with a lighter pack from there up to the summit. So things to know before we go. People who do this climb very commonly are going to be seven summiters, just meaning that a lot of our clients there are looking to climb the highest point on each of the seven continents. We have some clients that do this very early on in their seven summit career. Pretty common though, for people to finish their seven summits with either Mount Vinson or Everest. Also a popular climb for folks that aren't necessarily doing the seven summits, but climbers who use this as a good excuse just to get to Antarctica. Again, it's a very unique place, and this gives them an opportunity to go down, do a big peak in the most remote continent in the world. Or again, just people looking for a unique climbing experience. There's nothing like this anywhere else on the planet. For people who are going to be going to Mount Vinson, what we look for at Alpine Ascents is going to be folks with excellent self-care and campcraft, folks that have some climbing experience and are able to take care of themselves and stay safe in very cold environments. You'll notice in a lot of the photos that we have very beautiful, clear skies. Um, that looks better in the pictures and is easier to kind of show what the mountain looks like. But it can get quite extreme up there in terms of weather and storms. So we want folks that are able to take care of themselves and not get things like frostbite. Of the seven summits, I think this would be probably the most common place to get cold injuries. Of course, we're careful in selecting clients for Alpine Ascents, and we have very good guide staff down there to help prevent that. But again, very extreme environments. We're looking for folks that can help take care of themselves while they're down there. Again, it's a moderate mountain in terms of technicality. And so clients need to be able to perform well cramponing on firm snow or potentially a little blue ice. There's no vertical climbing, technical climbing like that. But just folks that are comfortable on firm snow tend to do well there. And also people that have the technical skills. We don't necessarily need people that, are able to climb independently or can tie all the knots and do the things, but just have the skills to, say, be able to pull a sled. And those are all things that we review in Antarctica, but we find that folks that have a little bit of experience with that prior to going down just have a little more fun on the trip. Just in my experience, I think the less new skills that people are taking on an expedition, the more fun they're able to have just kind of practicing familiar techniques. The last couple things are big down there. We definitely want people to be team players. It is a group expedition for sure. So we move as a team, and our success as a team is always going to be dependent on each of the individuals on that team. So looking for folks that do well in a team environment. And then finally, and this is a big one on any expedition climb, but certainly on Mount Vinson, are it's great if people have the ability to be flexible. Antarctica being the unique place it is and having the unique weather that it does, we often see delays in getting onto the continent or getting off. Like any major expedition climb, there are things that come up, and if we're looking to be rigid and do things at exact time every day, that can be a little more challenging for folks. But having a bit more of a go with the flow attitude there, I think is really beneficial for our climbers. It's also one of the hardest skills I think to develop, but Antarctica is a good place to test that skill. In terms of prerequisites that Alpine Ascents has for our climbers, we need everyone that's down there to have done one of our mountaineering courses, whether it's a 6, 8, 9, or one of our 10-day courses here in Washington or Alaska, or equivalent experience from somewhere else. In terms of other mountain experience, at a minimum, we require that people have experience on glaciated peaks, either here in Washington or up in Alaska, or some similar experience on another continent. And while we don't require high altitude experience before going to Vinson, the people that we see excel down there often have at least some experience with that. Something like an Aconcagua, Ecuador, Mexican volcanoes climbs, I think are all really wonderful training grounds to go to Mount Vinson. And we find that people who have experience sleeping at higher altitudes and being more comfortable in the cold just generally tend to enjoy the trip a bit more with that experience. And here's a quick video here of kind of the progress of travel to get down. And our climb is going to start in Punta Arenas, Chile. So everyone is going to fly to South America before bouncing down to Antarctica, and we'll get into the details of these flights and things in a bit. But we fly into the interior and then get on a smaller plane and bounce over to Vinson Base Camp. Is a relatively short flight. It's about 45 minutes. And once we've arrived there, we have 3 camps on the mountain. We fly into Vinson Base Camp. It's a day of travel to our low camp at 9,000 feet. We go up the fixed lines to high camp at 14,400, and then moderately long summit day, usually 10 or 12 hours up to the summit and back to our high camp before descending back down the mountain. So a little more detail on those things. Again, we start the trip in Punta Arenas, Argentina, or excuse me, Chile. And for most people, if you're coming from North America, for example, it's usually about 2 days of travel to get down there. If we're coming from, say, Africa, there might be an additional half to 1 day of travel on top of that. Punta Arenas is a really interesting city, unique place. The food there is amazing. It's right on the coast. You see a lot of cruise ships and major like shipping containers coming through on a daily basis. The seafood there is incredible. A lot of what we eat down there was caught just earlier that day or the day before. And if we have a little extra time down there, it's a really interesting place to do a little travel and check out. The penguins are there. There's some islands that you can get on a little ship and go over and see penguins on the coast, which is pretty beautiful. And in Punta Arenas, we typically have about 2 to 3 days there to do some orientation, meet the team, do our gear check, make sure that we have all the things that we need. Obviously, there's not, an REI, in Antarctica for us to get gear when we get down there. So we want to make sure that we fly in with all the appropriate stuff. And then it's a very interesting flight to get down there, and there's some different logistics. So we have a meeting with our logistic company down there to discuss the flight, and that process usually takes somewhere in the 2 to 3 day range. And a big thing down there is we need good weather. We need proper weather to be able to depart Punta Arenas, and we need good weather to be able to land outside of our camp in Antarctica. And so weather delays there are certainly possible, but at a minimum, 2 to 3 days in Punta Arenas is what we need. After that, we fly to Union Glacier, Antarctica, and that flight is incredible. It's absolutely gorgeous. And we do this on a very large plane. We fly in on a commercial jet. It's a 757 that we go in on. It's actually a plane that's contracted from Iceland Air. So the journey starts off with a pretty typical feeling of going through security, going through the airport and getting on a large plane. And then we start going south and get some beautiful views of specifically the Ellsworth mountain range as we're flying in. And then about an hour before landing, they crank up the air conditioning in the plane and everyone changes into their Arctic gear. And it's kind of a unique thing to see a bunch of people in 8,000-meter coats and big triple boots sitting in an airplane. And then we land on the blue ice runway in Antarctica. There's no buildings there. When we walk off the plane, it's directly onto the glacier. This is, again, I keep using the word unique, but I think the most unique airport in the world. They've specifically chosen this spot on the glacier because there's no crevasses there. The ice itself is very dense, and they land this 757 on the blue ice runway. You walk down the stairs, and your first step in Antarctica is directly onto the glacier. It's often -20 or -30 degrees Fahrenheit when we step off the plane. So you can see all the guests are wearing their big puffy coats. They pull the luggage off with this giant forklift and they put it on sleds and pull all of our luggage to Union Glacier, which is about a 5 mile drive away. And as you can imagine, in Antarctica, for crossing glaciers, it's not the typical airport shuttle. We often are riding in something like this, which is a 6x6 Ford F-550 that's been seriously modified for glacier travel. And that brings us to the kind of the main camp down there at Union Glacier. And that camp is the jumping off point for several different expeditions and different adventures that occur in Antarctica. For us, it's where we transition from, probably a good analogy is from our international flight onto the continent to a little bit more of a domestic flight in a smaller plane. And this little village there is set up to hold about 200 people. There's a large dining tent, bathrooms, things like that. And our time there can vary greatly. If the weather is good and we can go straight into Mount Vinson, we might be there for as little as 2 hours, just waiting to get our luggage, transfer onto the next plane and move over. Or again, depending on weather, we need good weather to leave Union Glacier. We need good weather at Vinson Base Camp to land, and also good visibility for these small planes to fly between those two places. The next slide here is I'm just going to do a 30 or 40 second little intro video that I think does a much better job explaining Union Glacier than I could. So short film here for you.
This is Union Glacier Camp, a remote field camp in the heart of Antarctica. It operates from November through January and acts as a logistics hub to support private expeditions and national science programs, but also provides accommodation for up to 70 guests. It's located in the southern Ellsworth Mountains on the broad expanse of Union Glacier, and it's the only facility of its kind on the continent. The reason it's here is the blue ice runway. This area of naturally occurring blue ice is good enough for large aircraft to land on, and they can supply the camp. It's also the perfect staging point for expeditions to Mount Vinson, the South Pole, Gould Bay, and the vast range of mountains that dominate the horizon.
So for what it's worth, a large plane that you saw landing there on the runway is a massive Russian military plane called an Ilyushin. And that used to be the only way that we could commercially get folks in to climb Mount Vinson. And while it's an amazing piece of flight history, wasn't the most comfortable flight in. If you hear stories about people that have been on Vinson, say 5-10 years plus ago, you flew on this big military plane. There's no windows. You're just facing a bunch of cargo that was under nets, and you take off in South America, land in Antarctica, and see nothing in between. The upgrade now to the 757 is great. We have TVs on the plane. We're fed a meal. We have great views on the way in. So that's been a really great upgrade for us. But bouncing back to our itinerary here, when we have the proper weather and are able to, we take a short flight. It's about 45 minutes from Union Glacier to Vinson Base Camp. Again, just once in a lifetime kind of flight. It's absolutely gorgeous. The photos from these flights are unbelievable. And next, we got a short video here of a flight landing at Vinson Base Camp. You can see it's just absolutely in the middle of nowhere. There's no footprints, no paths, no roads. It's just us kind of in the middle of nothing on the glacier here. It's also pretty cool because it's the closest we're ever going to get to a large plane like this landing. And the flights that we go in on are typically planes that are just big enough to get the entire team in, which is great. We typically all come in together and we don't have to wait on multiple planes. Once we've landed at Vinson Base Camp, we dig up our cash from the previous year there, and we typically plan on spending 1 or 2 days there at a minimum. Again, weather being a major factor there. But it's where we start to prep everything for our climb. We start to review skills for things like pulling sleds. Sometimes we'll go for a little acclimatization hike, just do a little shakedown. But we've got a really lovely place there. You can see in the photo here, we use these large North Face 2-meter domes. It gives everybody an opportunity to get in out of the cold, have a comfortable place to sit and hang out and eat. The social component of hanging out in Vinson Base Camp is one of my favorite things there. And the food that we have is fantastic, and we'll get to that in a bit. That base camp is just under 7,000 feet above sea level, and it's a very nice place to start the climb for a very reasonable and slow acclimatization schedule. From base camp, we move our way up to our low camp on Mount Vinson. Low camp's situated right at 9,000 feet. And to get there, it's about 5.5 miles with only 2,100 feet of elevation gain. So pretty low to moderately angled slopes. It's a nice kind of way to ease in. And again, relatively light loads here. On average, I would say that the typical client is going to have 20 to 25 pounds on their back, and then an additional 20 or 30 pounds in the sled. Relatively easy going as far as sled pulling goes. This would be maybe some more typical weather that we would see there. It's not the best picture in the world, but just kind of like to throw it in that not every day is these bright, beautiful, sunny days, especially down low. We do tend to get a lot of fog there. It's usually quite overcast. But weather like this is still perfectly fine to move in. We don't typically see a lot of super low visibility there, mostly because, again, we don't have a whole lot of issue with precipitation. If we do have low vis, it's going to be just because it's fog moving in from lower down the mountain. Our low camp, again, is going to have a cache with most of our equipment in it, situated right at 9,000 feet. So at this point, again, very moderate acclimatization schedule. We've had several days moving from sea level just up to 9,000 feet. So most people do very well with the acclimatization schedule there and are typically still feeling very good at this elevation. The move up there typically takes about 4 to 6 hours. And not always, but typically we have at least one rest day at this camp. So we do one moderately physical day moving up, and then we typically have a day or two here where we continue to review skills on things like moving up the fixed line, discussing a little more detail on self-care for things higher on the mountain where it gets colder. And it's a bit of a staging point from here for our summit push. What we're looking at from here is a window of a few good days of weather so that we can move to our high camp summit and then descend back down. The views from low camp are beautiful. Some of the geology there in the points behind camp here is absolutely beautiful. Again, very pristine place. A little hard to see here in the photo, but this handful, 6 or 8 dots, is low camp from an adjacent ridge. Our route comes in from the right-hand side of the screen into low camp, and then from here we move up to the base of this hill, and you can see a small line here that is the fixed lines. We take a break over here on the way up and then push up here. That's almost 2,000 vertical feet. It's a good bit of time on these fixed lines, and then our high camp is situated just in behind this rock face. The move to high camp is a little bit longer day. It typically takes 6 to 10 hours depending on the group and the weather. Much shorter distance mileage wise is only 3.6 miles, but a really significant amount of elevation gain. We pick up 3,400 feet that day and are moving into a high camp at 12,400 feet. Again, with the amount of time that we have, people are usually very well acclimatized by the time we get there. The views on the way up are gorgeous. This is a shot to the east from the top of the fixed lines. And here's a team moving up the fixed lines. I think that's pretty representative of the average angle of the fixed lines. Just because of the remoteness of this climb, we tend to be more conservative there than we might be in other places that are a little more accessible. So we have fixed lines starting on terrain that's as shallow as like 15 or 20 degrees, And then the maximum steepness here is going up to about 35 or 40 degrees. So not terribly steep, but just because it is so remote, it's great to have the additional safety of our fixed lines. And this would be looking back down toward the top of the fixed lines. There's this really beautiful pyramidal peak in the background as we ascend. For what it's worth, that's a guide there that's a little bit larger pack than the average client would typically have. But again, Antarctica, not a lot of fresh snow. It's typically firm cramponing on some pretty packed snow. And this is another view that's right before our high camp, looking back down this is Mount Shin in the back of the picture. Really beautiful mountain that sees very few ascents. I would say maybe gets climbed once every 3 or 4 years. And another shot of that pyramidal peak. And then we're at high camp. Typically at high camp, we like to have a rest day before we go up for our summit push. If we have a shorter weather window, that's not always guaranteed, but we try to go up there and have a rest day if possible. But if the weather dictates, we may move straight from there into our summit push. But high camp, again, in terms of our 7 summits, not horribly high, just at 12,400 feet, still higher than any established camp anywhere here in the US. But again, lots of time to acclimate there. People are typically still continuing to feel very good at our high camp. And then we get into our summit day. Summit day itself is not terribly high angle. The steepest part of the entire climb is going to be the fixed lines. But we do cover some mileage on our summit day. It's a total of about 9 miles round trip. And again, depending on conditions, on weather, and the team itself, we typically expect that summit day to be somewhere in the 9 to 12-hour range. The route on the way up here would start kind of the bottom left-hand side of the screen. This would be an hour or so outside of base camp. We go across this kind of long, flat plateau and then work our way up right underneath this blue ice that we see here. The next to the last break of the day occurs right here at this bench and then works its way up to the shoulder up to the summit of Mount Vinson here. This would be a shot from the third break, kind of part way up that face, looking back toward Mount Shin. This was a pretty average summit day for us. Really beautiful weather, probably -20, -25. Feels actually quite comfortable when we're moving, but when you stop, of course, it's the big heavy coats and mittens. And then this is a shot from an adjacent ridge. You can see here again, relatively low slope angle here. And then on our summit day, this would be the crux of our climb in terms of steepness. Not especially steep, probably looking at slope angles here between 25 and 35 degrees, but we are getting up to the like 15,500 foot range. And so it does become quite challenging just, from an elevation standpoint. But technically speaking, not super steep. And then from here, the route goes basically up the ridge line that we can see here. Our last break is on snow here. We get into a little bit of rock scrambling, some third-class terrain. And then Vinson has one of the most distinct, proper, small summits of any of the 7 summits. The views there are absolutely incredible, just 360-degree panoramic views of almost entirely unclimbed peaks all the way around us. And then, excuse me, let me bounce back here. From there, the descent is going to be back down to our high camp, spend the evening there, and then descending, we're able to move at a little quicker pace, of course, than we would going up. And we can descend from our high camp directly back to Vinson Base Camp, have a celebration there. There's usually some champagne and charcuterie for us. And after that, we're just waiting on proper weather to fly back to Union Glacier and then Punta Arenas, and then, of course, back home to wherever we came from. As far as logistics go, I would say that, obviously I'm biased here, but I think we have, the most dialed program down there. due in large part to our guide staff. And I don't want to be, saying anything about myself here, but I can certainly say that the two lead guides that we have down there, Ben Jones and Jangbu Sherpa, are absolutely the best of the best world-class climbers. Ben has been doing this program, our Kilimanjaro programs, Everest, going back for decades. He just had his 10th Everest summit just a couple weeks ago. He typically runs the first couple climbs of the year, and then Jangbu runs the second half of the season. He's from Nepal originally, Sherpa, but lives here outside the Seattle area now, and is one of the coolest and hardest working guides that I've ever worked with. I just spent a couple months on Everest with him in Nepal, and he's a pleasure to work with. And either of these guides that you would end up with, you'd be lucky to be with them. Fantastic staff down there. As far as the food goes, for me, it's one of the highlights of the trip. This is one of the few expeditions that I do that I typically come home a little heavier than when I left. The food that we have down there is great. The guides cook breakfast and dinner for our guests every day. Our lunches are typically moving lunches, so that's going to be kind of snacks throughout the day. And the food that we have down there is great. We don't go down and spend a couple weeks eating dehydrated meals. We get great, fresh, high quality food from Chile. The things that we can't source well there, we actually ship down from the US. We do a big Costco run before we go and get all the things we need to provide high quality food for our guests while we're down there. Other considerations with some logistics down there. And Antarctica is the most pristine, untouched area that I've ever been to. So we have a high level of environmental responsibility while we're there. There's a treaty that all the countries that work down there have signed, the IOTA treaty, that just ensures that future guests, 20, 30, 50 years from now, get to see this incredible place in the same way that we did. And you'll find that in Antarctica, it's just absolutely pristine. There's no trash down there. The guide services are held to a very, very high standard to continue to work down there. And we pass that on with our clientele. The level of environmental responsibility and the ethic down there is the highest I've seen anywhere on the planet. And of course, on any trip, human waste is always something that comes up. I don't know if I've ever been on an expedition that made it more than 2 or 3 days without having a poop talk. But the way human waste is handled down there is actually very unique. For those of you that have done an expedition with us before, probably very familiar with the wag bag system and how that works. That's pretty standard for solid waste in Antarctica, but Antarctica is the only place in the world that I've been where in certain places we actually also have to carry out our pee. Again, with it being a desert down there, we can't just pee in the snow anywhere. There are designated places on the route up Mount Vinson, designated pee holes where everyone goes. But if we have to go anywhere else, we actually pee into a pee bottle and carry it with us to the next hole. I've been working down there for several years, and in the extremely rare case that we see somebody from another team pee in the snow, we see that same spot for the next, 2 or 3 years at least. Again, so nothing gets covered up. There's no fresh snow. So on Mount Vinson, which is about as remote as you get, we have designated spots there. At some of the larger camps like Union Glacier, all of that is put into large containers, and they actually put it back onto a cargo plane, and they fly all the liquid and solid waste back to be disposed of in South America. Again, kind of unique system there. I'm not familiar with any place else in the world that does that. In terms of gear, like a lot of our Arctic climbs, this is a very gear-heavy climb, and we could definitely do like a 4-hour webinar just on gear. But a couple quick notes for those of you considering going. Definitely follow the gear list and bring absolutely everything that's on it. Some of these things we can't source in Punta Arenas, and we definitely can't once we get into Antarctica. So the gear list that we have is something that we've put together over decades and decades of climbing down there. A lot of thought has gone into it. It's modified on a yearly basis. And if it's not on the gear list, you don't need it down there. And if it is on the gear list, you might have a hard time completing the trip without it. But a lot of thought has gone into that, and I fully stand behind every single item on that list. I would recommend, if you are planning to go, buy high quality gear. We are absolutely taking it to one of the harshest environments in the planet, and some of the very specific technical gear, like our triple boots and our 8,000 meter pants and jackets and things, those are designed specifically for climbs like this. There's not a lot of places in the world that we need those things, but that gear is made just for Everest and Antarctica. It's pretty specific to what we're doing down there. Light gear training is something that we could spend a lot of time talking about. There's a ton of great information on our website regarding training for this climb. And again, don't want to dive too deep into that now, but I will say, in my experience, the folks that I've worked with down there that have put in the time ahead of time to do the training, I think find the trip much more enjoyable. On Mount Vinson, as well as any other mountain I've ever been on, I've never heard someone say post-climb that they wish they would have trained less. I think the fitter we are, the stronger we are, the more we can go down and enjoy the trip and have fun and take in everything that Mount Vinson has to offer versus just kind of, working hard and pushing our way through it and just kind of surviving the trip. And then finally, one last thing to consider in terms of logistics down there. There is a ski program. It's not for necessarily people who are very familiar with downhill skiing, but it's a cross-country ski trip that goes to the South Pole. They fly into the 89th parallel and ski in the last 60 miles to the South Pole. That program's called Ski the Last Degree. It in and of itself is an incredible adventure and something that I highly recommend. But I think that clients going down to do Vinson should consider that. There's, of course, the Seven Summits track that a lot of our clients are on. They want to climb the highest point on each of the seven summits. But in addition to that, when people finish up those seven summits, I think a lot of folks are often asking, what's next, or, what's the next thing to do? Something that's been pretty popular in the last few years is people completing what we call the Adventurers Grand Slam, which is the highest point on each continent, and also skiing to the North and South Pole. It's a lot more time and cost efficient if you do the last degree in combination with Vinson. I've had a lot of clients that wish they would have done it and not had to do a second trip to Antarctica. But that said, if there's any place in the world that you have to go twice, going down to Antarctica is certainly not a bad place to have to go. So in terms of logistics and things, that's all I have on that. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and attention. I believe we've still got about 15, 20 minutes here for questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary and let her take it from here.
Oh my gosh, Don, what a great presentation. I had no idea that you had, well, I didn't know about a lot of that stuff, to be honest. So, I also did not know that you had to carry your urine off the continent. That is so interesting.
Not all of it, not all of it. But while we're on Mount Vinson, we don't have to compile it all there. But yeah, it's the cleanest place in the world. It's amazing down there.
We don't have a lot of questions in the chat currently, so please put your questions in, not the chat, the Q&A box. But there were some questions floating around in the webinar chat. One of them was avalanches. Is that a risk on Vinson, or not so much with the very limited snowfall?
Yeah, that's a great question and a major consideration on any of the big peaks that we climb. In my experience, avalanches aren't completely unheard of there, but because of the lack of new snow accumulation, being that it is a desert, it's the least amount of avalanche activity that I have seen on any major peak anywhere in the world. In my experience down there, and I haven't been down there quite as much as, say somebody like Ben or Jangbu, but in the last few years, I've spent about 6 months of my life down there. I've seen one avalanche, and that was a result of ice fall, technically considered an avalanche, but there's a serac there that pours over. And I've got a video of it somewhere. It's a relatively small avalanche, doesn't come anywhere near the route. Um, Again, with this climb being so remote and it being so hard to get people in and out of, a lot of time and effort has gone into very carefully selecting a route that avoids those areas because realistically, evacs there are very challenging and can take quite a bit of time. So the risk tolerance down there, while it's very low on any Alpine Ascents climb, I would say it's lower on Mount Vinson than anywhere else. And the likelihood of avalanche there is, again, I'll never say impossible, but incredibly low.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we do have some questions in the chat now. We noticed that Vinson's pretty cold. It's in Antarctica. Why no down suits on the gear list? What's the 411?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. It does seem counterintuitive, right? They make these 8,000-meter suits for incredibly cold places. The primary difference in Antarctica and specifically climbing a Mount Vinson than say like a Mount Everest or a Monaslu is that it's at a lower elevation. Typically speaking, the higher we go, the colder we get, of course, in ambient temperature, but also just in our bodies. As we go higher with less oxygen in our blood, our bodies start to shunt blood out of our hands and fingers and toes and try and keep our blood closer to our core to protect vital organs. So the elevation is one thing, and also associated with the elevation is the speed at which we climb. On Vinson, and there's no set standard there, but we're probably moving more at a rate of, 600 to 800 feet an hour on our summit day, whereas on an Everest, we're moving at half or a third of that speed. And as a result, because we're able to move at a little quicker pace, we're creating more energy, we're giving off more heat, and we just don't need all that additional insulation. Whereas, say, like a summit day on Everest, it might be -5 or 5 degrees, and we need that big 8,000-meter down suit. A 35 or a -35 degree day on Mount Vinson, because we're able to move, our bodies will actually feel warmer. And we find that when people do the hold down suit, when the sun is out, they actually have a tendency to overheat and sweat on Mount Vinson. It can be, and no joke, it can be -25 down there. And when the sun is out, and especially if there's no wind, we've been able to climb up there in like sun hoodies or a small, mid layer, and the 8,000-meter suits are just overkill. We like to have the versatility of the two-piece so we can take it on and off as needed.
Nice. Great answer. Next question is about the ski of the last degree. Would you call that more of a ski traverse? Is there any downhill skiing on that?
No, there's not. It's up on the Antarctic plateau. If you were to look at like a topographic map of the continent, any place around the perimeter of the continent is relatively flat and low angle, and then it all juts up a few hundred miles inland into the Antarctic plateau. That is typically going to be somewhere in the like 85 to 9,500 feet above sea level range, but it's pretty flat. It's a plateau. So it's done on cross-country skis. Where they are is quite flat. So it's definitely more of a crossing as opposed to downhill skiing.
Okay, nice. Do you recommend, okay, this is another gear question, double boots plus insulated over boots or triple boots? Like, what are some of the pros and cons of either of those systems?
Yeah, so super common question. And I think a really important one relative to potentially other climbs that people are doing. If someone is on the Seven Summits track and they're planning to do, say, like an Everest or another 8,000-meter peak in the future, or if they've done one in the past, I think the 8,000-meter boots are a really handy thing to have. That's always what I use when I'm there. But that said, it's because I have a few pairs of them and I use them in other places. If one isn't planning to do that, then I think double boots, which would be a much more common boot that we'd use in a lot of other places, in combination with an overboot, is also a really good option. And if we don't plan on doing an 8,000-meter peak, maybe not splurging and getting that $1,500 or $2,000 pair of boots wouldn't be necessary. Both have some pros and cons. The triple boot being warmer, but a little maybe less vertical, or excuse me, a little less versatile than a double boot. For something like Denali, I think the double boot option is a really great system to use. Then your feet aren't as warm, sweating down low on the mountain, and we can put the overboot on just for the last couple days of the trip. However, Mount Vinson is pretty cold the entirety of the trip, so we don't necessarily need that versatility. And if people have triples, they're handy but not necessary.
Wonderful. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A about specific training courses, like can you do your training in Europe? Can you do your training in South Africa? For those type of questions, I would actually recommend emailing climb@alpineascents.com. We'll have our director of, what's his title these days? Director of the field, Jonathan Spitzer, and he can walk you through your climbing resume and like what courses would be appropriate. Because there's so much variability in people's climbing experience and background that it's usually best as a conversation. So please email us at climb@alpineascents.com if you have questions about the prerequisites.
I'll chime in on that just real quickly.
Yes.
The short answer to those questions is yeah. Wherever you're coming from, there are ways to make that happen 100%. And we'd be happy to help facilitate that. A lot of the clientele that we have down there is international. And I should have mentioned that earlier. I was talking about things in terms of, miles and feet. We kind of speaking to more of a North American audience, we have a really diverse group of clientele that go down there from all over the world, and there's ways to make that training happen quite easily no matter where you are, and there's a logical progression of climbs to do close to home for you wherever you're at.
Excellent. Thanks, Don. We have a couple more questions. With the variability in the itinerary, thanks to the weather, how do you recommend that people schedule their flights home?
Having flights, especially return flights that are flexible, I think is a very good idea. And I don't remember exactly what day, after the end trip date we recommend. I know that it is on the website, and Mary might be able to find that while I'm talking. I will say that what we have on the website appears to be a little bit longer trip than some other companies offer. It's a more conservative schedule based on having more days of flexibility, so that people get home on time. Historically, I think we've had a very good track record of getting folks out on time. But again, the weather being beyond our control, it's not something that we can guarantee. I think one trip that we do is typically our second one of the year, that puts you home right before Christmas. Obviously, on anything like this where, weather is a major factor and we don't have control over that, having some flexibility there is a good idea. I wouldn't recommend that you plan your wedding or any major events within a couple days of the trip. It's nice to have a little bit of extra time there. And if we have a date that's an absolute make or break for you, that's right at the tail end of a trip, potentially consider other dates. We offer 4 trips every year. There's kind of a range of options there. And so if you have any major life events, just give yourself, at least a few days buffer there. I've been really fortunate every time I've gone down, I've flown out on time. But, I've also heard of folks getting held up by, as much as a week, in some cases. But that's the exception as opposed to the norm.
I don't know if you'll know this question, the answer to the question, because I certainly do not. Do we offer extensions to Mount Sidley?
It's not on the website. It's not something that we have in our major published catalog of options down there. If someone wanted to do it, I'm sure it's something that we could accommodate. I know that it's done. I know that we can get flights there. For those of you maybe that aren't familiar with Sidley, it is the highest volcano in Antarctica. And so kind of similar to the idea of the Adventurers Grand Slam, some folks are doing in combination with the 7 summits or in addition to it, wanting to do the highest volcano on each continent. And as few people as go to Mount Vinson, I would say maybe 5 or 10% of that number go to Sidley. It's not done terribly often. I'm guessing here, but I would say there's somewhere in the range of 0 to 10 people a year who climb it. It's a pretty rare climb, really, really remote, and a very beautiful climb. But yeah, I would say for specifics on that, please feel free to reach out to us, and I'm sure that we could help accommodate that.
Okay. There's a couple more questions in the chat, and then we'll let you get all back to your day. Don, do you have a sense of our Vinson climbing season, when the weather is the most stable?
The weather in general there is relatively consistent throughout the season. If we're comparing it to say like a Denali season, I think there's more distinct changes in weather there throughout the season than we would see in Antarctica. It's a relatively short season, and if you booked this trip on the exact same date every year for 10 years in a row and went down and did that trip, you'd probably have 10 variations of weather. With that said, if we look at averages historically, generally the first trip or two of the year is going to be a little bit colder, and the last couple trips of the year might be slightly warmer, but potentially with a little bit more wind. In my opinion, the weather down there from trip to trip is kind of a wash. There's actually an even earlier trip that some companies offer, and that one is a quite cold one. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that very first one of the year. There's 5 trips a year offered by the flight service down there. We take advantage of the last 4. I think that any of those work out great. When people ask about dates down there, I think the more important consideration would be one, what works best for you and your timeline? What's going to, be the least stressful thing for you in your itinerary or in your calendar? Is there a particular guide that you want to work with? If you had a great experience, with Ben Jones on Mount Everest and you'd like to spend another expedition with him, then great. If you've, had a lot of good experiences with Jangbu and you want to hang out with him on one of the later trips, then obviously go with that. If you don't have a preference, then yeah, I would say just go with whichever climb happens to work best in your schedule. The weather doesn't change dramatically from trip to trip in the time that we're down there.
Awesome. Okay, Don, this was amazing. I have one final question from me to you. What is your favorite part about guiding Mount Vinson?
My favorite part of guiding Mount Vinson is just being in Antarctica. It's just so different from any place else in the world. I've been really privileged to have been able to visit a lot of amazing places, but just being in a place that is that pristine is incredible. I can't think of anywhere else in the world where you can go and spend 2 or 3 weeks of your life and not see another living thing other than humans. There's no birds, there's no bugs. It's just an incredibly unique experience to be, frankly, in a place that we're not meant to be, and to be able to take that time and live there and get to one of the highest points or the highest point on the continent, is just a really special experience.
Nice, wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing. Again, thank you so much for this presentation. It was super helpful and informative. Everyone, if you did not take notes, do not fear. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Alpine Ascents blog in about 2 to 3 business days. If you have questions that did not get answered, or as soon as we tune out, you're like, oh, I have all these questions, do feel free to email us at climb@alpineascents.com. Or if you do have a gear question, you can email our gear experts at gear@alpineascents.com. But thank you so much for tuning in. Check out this on our blog shortly, and we have a ton of other webinars for our other climbs and courses as well on our YouTube channel. Okay, that's all I got. Thanks again, Don.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you down there.
Bye. See you in the mountains.